about an interesting topic, which is theories of cognitive theories of bilingualism. As a reminder, I want to tell you something because I'm going to compare what you have read to what you already know. So you remember that in the class, we already talked about my approach, where basically I explained to you that according to my approach, what we have in the bilingual mind is a common underlying conceptual base. So that will be important because later, we're going to compare that to the common underlying proficiency that Jim Cummins speaks about. So I want to explain to you what the difference is. But before I do so, I need to explain again what I mean by the common underlying conceptual base. So the idea is that basically we have a common underlying conceptual base that operates the two language channels. So the two language channels are always present. So that's why we say that CAIS, you see this acronym there, which means that constantly available interacting systems, which means that, of course, the two languages are constantly available, and whenever the speaker needs to use the other channel, he can go and switch to the other channel. So the important thing is that in the conceptual base, we have the different kind of knowledge domains, the concepts and images. And so when we produce language, usually we have something that we call preverbal thought. So we have thoughts in our idea, in our head, but we haven't formulated those thoughts yet into language. So it's very important that human thinking can be without language as well. So we do not necessarily need language for thinking. Of course, most of the time we think in language, but not always. And of course, in the conceptual base, we have these images, knowledge domains, concepts that are the results of our prior experience. Okay, so the prior experience creates these pieces of knowledge, concepts, and images that are in our mind. And then when we want to say something, this preverbal thought is put into one of the language channels. But the important thing is that what we do first is select words. So occasionally, it is possible that at the level of preverbal thoughts, we start to kind of select words, not only from one language, but from two languages as well. So it is possible that, when you try to kind of formulate something, then that words from both languages come up. However, that you want to say something in German, for example, because that is your second language, then of course you try to kind of subdue all the other words that come up from the other language. Okay, and of course the result is some kind of a structure, because when you formulate something, you already have to use a certain structure. So you have to arrange these words in a particular order. But earlier, I emphasized to you that basically this is a back and forth process, which means that you start to formulating something, then you stop and go back to the preverbal thought level, and then reformulate it, and so on. So this is a very dynamic up and down process and interplay between the common underlying conceptual base and the language channels that we have, okay? And it even happens sometimes depending on what environment you are in. Then you start to kind of formulate an utterance in one of the languages, then you realize that maybe that other person, that the other person is a bilingual, so you decide to go through the other language channel. So I want to emphasize this kind of flexibility and dynamism that this interplay is characterized with. And of course, when after the formulation, we utter what is there after all. So that's the third stage of language production. But this is, be careful, because this is a linear order. This is the ideal linear order, how it happens. But in practice, what happens is this back and forth all the time. So this kind of a movement between the conceptual system and the word selection and the formulation after. Okay, so this is most of the time, ideally is a linear process, but usually, especially in oral production, it is not. But even in writing, I told you several times that when you write an essay for something like that, then you start to create a sentence, maybe you even write it down, and then you don't like it, so you go back and you reformulate it and so on. Before I came here to this class, I was writing a review of a colleague at another university who wants to be a full professor, and I had to write a review on her academic research. And, I spent like 2 hours writing 1.5 pages because I was going back and forth. I created a sentence and I said, well, it's not good. And I rewrote that. And then, when the paragraph was ready, I read the paragraph again, and then I went and changed this and that. So this is how language works, in writing and in oral production as well. But in oral production, of course, this whole thing is faster than in writing. Okay, so the point is that what you have to remember later, because we'll talk about the Jim Commins's ideas, that here what we do is that we separate the conceptual system from the language channels. So we actually have the conceptualizer and the formulator and the articulator, after all. So this is what is characteristic for this language production system. Do you have any questions in connection with this? Is that clear? But I want to emphasize that this is one of the possible approaches or one of the possible explanations. So it doesn't mean that there are no other explanations. Also, there are several out there. And the second one that we will have today is created by Jim Commins, okay, which is different from my approach. So later I'm going to explain that to you. Okay. So here is a summary of all this that I already said, that basically in the common underlying conceptual ways, we have the declarative knowledge, images, concepts, and preverbal thoughts. And the concepts, basically, according to this model, developed through 2 or more language channels. So when we learn something, that goes into our common underlying conceptual base. As far as Jim Commins is concerned, a long time ago, earlier in 1980, he talked about the fact that bilingual, what he called is the balance theory, because before 1980s, the main research line about bilingualism was that bilingual development happens at the expense of cognitive development. Knowing 2 languages leads to frustration and failure. That was the main idea about bilingualism, that, if you have 2 languages in your mind, that the second language takes space away from the first language. So that's why you will not be good in either of your languages. That was the main idea, So since language development is cognitive development, if you have 2 languages, you have to double your cognitive effort, basically, to produce 2 languages, And the conclusion was that if you know 2 languages, that leads to frustration and failure, which was, of course, quite a huge mistake. So, this is what they imagined, that, the monolingual you have 1 language, and bilinguals have 2 languages in the same space. Of course, this theory was stupid because, this is something like a bilingual is 2 monolinguals in one body, okay? So if you're bilingual, there are 2 monolinguals in your one body, But they didn't think about the fact because, that time, we didn't have MRI, or we didn't have other kind of ways to examine how the brain works. So that's why, they didn't understand how flexible the brain is. So it is not necessarily important for the brain how much information comes in, because the brain is very flexible and can take information, especially if the new incoming information can be tied to something that is already there. Okay, so it is easier for the brain, to actually handle new pieces of information if these new pieces of information are somehow tied or connected with something that is already in your brain. So that's why we say that the brain is not only computational, but the brain is relational as well, and mainly relational, which means, that whenever a new piece of information are coming to your mind, you automatically, subconsciously relate those things into to your existing pieces of information. So just this explains why people usually do not accept right away some new things, because you are suspicious when you are exposed to new things, and when people want you to do things in a different way, because you have already a set up in your mind, and it is very difficult to break up this setup because of the new pieces of information. Okay, so that's the real important thing. So going back to this chart that you see in front of you, we again have to quote Francois Grosjean, who said that a bilingual is not two monolinguals in one body. And the reason why we can say this, that a bilingual is not two monolinguals in one body, because we have this common underlying conceptual base where all information from the outside will go into, and then, that is actually comes to the two language channels that you have as a bilingual. And of course, what you have in your common underlying conceptual base is blended with the existing piece of information and the new pieces of information. Okay, and then your reactions, no matter which language channel you use, the first language or the second language, basically reflect this blend there. It's not a mixture now. Be careful, it's not a mix. It's a blend. These are two different things. Blending is absolutely different from mixing. So blending is flexible and dynamic again, which means that if you relate the new piece of information to the existing piece of information, you find common ground there. You can find some overlap, and that overlap can be more or less. But these things blend, but you can separate them if you need them. But if you act automatically, subconsciously, then you are under the influence of this blend. That's why, students who study in the United States for 4 or 5 years, and then they go back to their home country and they use their first language, occasionally their friends and family members will tell them that, they say some strange things or behave in a strange way or something, because that blend affects you subconsciously automatically, So you will not act like a monolingual anymore, but you will act according to this kind of blend of these two languages, and that's the reason why you experience this kind of issue that, you are not like you were as a monolingual speaker, because you have been exposed to another language, and all these pieces of information go into your mind and blend with the things that are there. And if you do not control your behavior, and you say, okay, I pay attention not to kind of not to let anything affect my behavior that comes from the other culture or from the other language. That's a conscious approach. You can do that. However, if you act naturally, subconsciously, automatically, you will be always under the influence of this blend. So not just that, okay, my first language is Vietnamese, and when I speak Vietnamese, I switch out everything that is connected with English. You cannot do that. You cannot do that because of this common underlying conceptual base. So that's the point. I just want to tell you that if you have any questions while I'm talking, please raise your hand or break in and ask the question. Okay, so let me know if something is not clear. And now we are with the so-called iceberg analogy that Cummins talked about. So as you see, his terminology is a common underlying proficiency. So the difference is that I always say, I myself say common underlying because this is common underlying, but I talk about conceptual base and he talks about proficiency. That's a great difference. I will try to explain that to you. So according to his theory, underneath the surface, the two icebergs are fused so that the two languages do not function separately. Both languages operate through the same central processing system. The last sentence is okay. So this is what he has. But you see that he says that the iceberg fused, the two languages do not function separately. They function, two languages function separately, and he is right when he says that they operate through the same central processing system. But the problem is that he speaks about the language only. So proficiency is connected with language. Proficiency is not connected with the conceptual system. So what is proficiency? Let's look at that. What is proficiency? If you look at the Wikipedia, it says proficiency may refer to language proficiency, the ability of an individual to speak or perform in an acquired language. This is a linguistic definition. It is connected with the ability to use the linguistic system for communicative purposes. And the other meaning is expertise, skill. The learned capacity to carry out predetermined results, often with the minimum outlay of time, energy, and both. So after all, in education, the term proficiency is used in a variety of ways, most commonly in reference to proficiency levels, scales, and cutoff scores on standardized tests and other forms of assessment, okay? So as you see, the common thing in these definitions is that it's about language, how your ability to use the language system to communicate, to perform, to speak, So there is no word about the conceptual side of the matter. We have to separate that, so the linguistic knowledge from the conceptual knowledge, because they are not the same things. We emphasize that in this class that when we look at something, some language production, we recognize right away that it is not a native language production, but it is a non-native language production. Based on what? Based on the selection of words. How people select words, because, for example, if I say, let's water the flowers, or let's wet the flowers, which is native? Let's water the flowers. If you say something like, let's wet the flowers, everybody will understand you, but we'll recognize right away that you are not a native speaker. Why? Because of the selection of the word, So here is the important thing, that, if you have a bilingual mind, a common underlying conceptual base, that blend that I talked about results in word selection that is not necessarily characteristic for the preferred ways of saying things in the target language. Okay, so after all, right away, even if you have a wonderful pronunciation, everybody will know that you are not a native speaker. You know, so that's why it's the second language shows us very well that we have to make a difference between the conceptual system and the linguistic knowledge. You can ask me, can you prove that we have something like this in the first language? Isn't it just a second language phenomenon? You can ask that. Yes, that's a good question, because you can say, oh, you know, that is in the second language, because there is something that is missing there. But now, even in the first language, you have that, because in the first language, we also have registers. If I am a carpenter and I talk to a medical doctor, you know, and the medical doctor use some medical terms I do not know. I have no conceptual background of those words that the guy used. You know, so I may not understand what he says. Okay, or I use, when I talk about, for example, when I talk to my doctor, I will not use medical terms. I will use terms or words that, you know, based on my prior experience, I have access to, you know, because conceptually, I have no idea what some of those terms that the doctor use mean, since I do not have a concept behind that in my mind. So I cannot handle that. If I want to handle that, you know, I have to develop that concept. And that shows very well that, okay, we have a difference between word and concept, you know. And of course, the conceptual things belong to the common underlying conceptual base, and their labeling is a part of the language or languages, because you have to, of course. So my problem, going back to Jim Cummins, is that he talks about proficiency, which is a linguistic phenomenon and not a conceptual phenomenon. So he recognizes, because this is something that I can accept, that both languages operate through the same central processing system. But this central processing system is basically conceptual and not linguistic. Okay, so that's a basic difference between my approach and his. So here is a chart that demonstrates basically, or a list, I would say, what the difference is between our approaches. So as far as Cummins is concerned, he speaks about the same central engine, capacity to store more than one language, information and knowledge through two languages, classroom language should be well developed, insufficiently developed second language means problems, and semilingualism means neither language is fully developed. So this is what he told. As you notice, everything is about language, 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 language. He doesn't even mention any kind of thing about conceptual knowledge, concepts, and relationship of language to concepts or something like this. You know, as far as the differences are concerned, the first one I already discussed. So we have a conceptual base and not proficiency that is common. The Cummins' CUP theory says nothing about the interaction of language channels. And there is an interaction of language channels. We talked about the bidirectional influence of languages. We talked about the additive period and the synergic period. And we said that in the synergic period of bilingual development, there is a bidirectional influence between the two languages. I just discussed this blending issue with you some minutes ago. And of course, as I mentioned, the third issue is that the CUP says nothing about bidirectional influence. And also, it doesn't mention the dynamism of bilingual development. What we mean by dynamism of bilingual development, that there is the additive period and the synergic period, but you go back and forth. So, for example, you are a visitor, a visiting scholar in the United States, and you spend 2 years here. And that 2 year results in significant development in your language proficiency. That may not necessarily be a significant development in your conceptual system development, because you can kind of communicate with in everyday life, but conceptually you may be behind. Of course, depending on what you do, because if you are in an academic environment, academically, your conceptual system will develop attached to the academic use of the English language. But if you do not necessarily expose yourselves to the locals, to the American students, so you mainly mingle with Chinese students or German students or whatever, other international students, then your conceptual system will not follow your proficiency development. So you can be very, very proficient orally, so you can communicate without any difficulty, but at the same time, your conceptual system is behind, so you may not necessarily understand quite a number of situation where utterances, idiomatic expressions, and stuff like that. So the interesting thing is, that Cummins speaks about this issue himself, which is almost, I would say, against his first theory, because he separates the basic interpersonal communicative skills from academic language proficiency. Later we're going to talk about BICS and COLP, as he calls them, basic interpersonal communicative skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. So after all, the point is that we have to discuss this kind of dynamic movement between the additive and the synergy. Oh, Brenda is here. Okay, are you okay, Brenda? Brenda, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Are you okay? Everything is fine?
Oh, yeah, everything is fine.
Okay, good to hear. That's all right. Okay, so let's go back to this thing. After all, what I want to emphasize that there is again a movement between the additive period and the synergic period. So if you are in the synergic period, that means high level of conceptual system and high level of proficiency. Okay. However, if you lose this exposure to the target language, so going back to my visiting scholar example, you spend 2 years in the United States, then you say return to China, you are a Chinese exchange student or visiting scholar, and you lose your exposure to the American language and culture, and you live in your country, and you have limited exposure to the language. You use English only in your classroom, you teach English in the Chinese school or whatever, but you have very little opportunity to mingle with native speakers of English or whatever. What happens? Your synergic period may go back to the additive period. So, your second language will develop back, so decrease. The proficiency will decrease, and also the conceptual level, the knowledge level will decrease. But if you have the opportunity to go back again, for example, then the situation, your bilingualism will change because you go back to the synergic period again. Okay, does this make sense? Yeah, definitely. I think, this is something, that happens. So I mentioned these things, these 5 things, because these things are not necessarily described in the Cummins' theory, in spite of the fact that they are very, very important. They are very, very important because we should refer to this unique bilingualism of the development of the bilingual system, dual language system, and of course what the difference is between the additive and synergic period, the bidirectional influence of languages, and so on. Okay, So do you understand now the difference between the two, or do you have some questions or doubts or whatever, comments? Okay, so looks like people are happy with that. So the next one is the so-called threshold theory. So I have no problem with the threshold theory because basically we can accept the claims of the threshold theory. The only problem is that it's very, very difficult to kind of test when and where you are, because the threshold theory says that there are two thresholds basically. And here is, I think I have the picture of that somehow, yes, here. Okay, so this is not mine, so that's why there is balanced bilingualism. You know, I don't accept balanced bilingualism. But as you see, there are these two thresholds, threshold here and the threshold is there. So if you look at the first threshold, under the first threshold, limited bilingualism. Students are not proficient in any language and are not at age appropriate level with major cognitive effects. This is Kim Cummins' approach. If you go beyond the first threshold, then it says less balanced bilingual. Students have developed proficiency in only one language and are not at age appropriate level with some positive and negative cognitive effects. And if you go beyond the second threshold, he emphasizes that there is balanced bilingualism. Students have developed proficiency in both languages and are at age-appropriate level with positive cognitive effects. So I accept that there are these two thresholds. So we have a first threshold and we can have a second threshold. However, when we talk about bilinguals, so when we are on the first threshold, then basically we have not necessarily appropriate, age-appropriate knowledge of either of the languages. Okay, so this is where we use the term semilingualism, you know, where you are not proficient in either of your languages. This happens very often when you know, you have access to immigrant kids who come from underdeveloped countries and they didn't have any education in their home country, or they had very limited education in their home country, and even their first language is not good enough for academic development, you know, and they do not have any English knowledge or very limited English knowledge only. So these people are under the first threshold. As far as the second threshold is concerned, the important thing here is, and it is not necessarily emphasized in this chart, that one of the languages is stronger than the other. So, you know, one of the languages is developing and the other language is usually decreasing. Okay, so the problem is exposure, how you are exposed to the two languages. So one of the languages is getting stronger or is already strong, and the other one has problems. Okay, so we can imagine someone like, based on what Cummins says here, that there is a person, you know, who is 12 years old, a student, and that student comes from Finland, and his Finnish language is very strong. He is very good at writing and reading in Finnish. So his first language is absolutely well developed. However, he knows very limited English. So that person is beyond the first threshold, but under the second threshold. You know, in order for you to get beyond the second threshold, you have to have a good proficiency in both languages and a common underlying conceptual base that is relatively well developed. But again, I do not recognize balanced bilingualism because I cannot imagine that you are exposed to two languages relatively similar way. So you need both languages exactly the same way as you need one language. Okay, because even if you are in a diglossic situation where two languages are spoken in the speech community, usually you use one language for this purpose and the other language for that purpose and so on. So it's impossible that you equally use both of your languages for all functions. So that's the reason why it is almost impossible to imagine something like a balanced bilingual. And the next issue is that I already mentioned, that Cummins made a difference between interpersonal communicative skills and academic language skills, which is very good and acceptable and even commendable, because definitely there is so we shouldn't assume that non-native speakers who have attained a high degree of fluency and accuracy in everyday spoken English have the correspondent academic language proficiency. You see how he is contradicting to himself, because in the first place, he doesn't use proficiency, but he speaks about proficiency because he says a high degree of fluency and accuracy in everyday spoken English. That's proficiency. Okay, that's proficiency. In the second part, he already speaks about academic language proficiency. So basically, in the first place, you can, in the first stage, you can have interpersonal communicative proficiency, and in the second, you can have academic language proficiency. So the point is that you are not necessarily proficient very well in the first part, and in the second part, he speaks about academic language proficiency, but it's not proficiency, but it's the knowledge, that we are talking about, not necessarily linguistic skills, but the language to understand higher level abstractions, the language that you need in an academic class when we talk about chemistry, physics, history, computer science, or whatever it is. Okay, so there is this difference, but the problem is that, at least in my opinion, in the basic interpersonal communicative skills are proficiency skills. So you are proficient, you can fluently speak in that particular language and with an acceptable accuracy. This is what it is. As far as COLP is concerned, this is cognitive academic language proficiency, so academic knowledge and skills to apply it, basically. Okay, so this is what he speaks about. So we can say that the first part, the basic interpersonal communication, is a relatively restricted code because it is about just the surface of the use of the language, where there is no strong conceptual support for the language. In the second part, the cognitive academic language proficiency, this cognitive support develops, and that's why we can call it elaborated code, because you actually raise your conceptual knowledge, and not only conceptual knowledge, but academic knowledge as well. Okay, so it happens many times when kids can communicate without any difficulty with the teachers or with their peers in the school, but at the same time they struggle in the academic classes because of their content area knowledge, limited content area knowledge, and that's the reason why Cummins basically made this difference. However, again, there is a problem. This is not necessarily a dichotomy, as Cummins speaks about that on the one hand, we have these interpersonal skills, and the other hand, we have cognitive academic language proficiency. This is a continuum. This is a continuum, again, up and down, So the more academic work you are exposed in the target language, the more you develop in the direction of the cognitive academic language proficiency. And again, if you lose this kind of school exposure, then you can easily go back to the other side. Okay, So you cannot separate the two things. They are intertwined. He separates them because he doesn't speak about the conceptual system. So the real problem is that here in BICS, we have good language skills. You have good language skills, you know, and you can communicate with everybody with your limited vocabulary. But it doesn't mean that your conceptual system is well developed. So you cannot handle academic work very well. In order for you to be able to handle academic work, you have to move to the right on the continuum in the direction of cognitive academic language proficiency. And this requires conceptual rearranging, okay? Conceptual rearranging and, of course, more declarative knowledge, you know, more declarative knowledge. And of course, if you have more declarative knowledge, that will affect your language proficiency as well, because you will be able to talk about that based on the vocabulary that you already have or that you start to develop further. Okay, so this is where we have to be very careful, because it's absolutely very important how we handle this important difference in language use. So basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. Again, I don't like here the proficiency word. So I would use something else because that's misleading in my opinion. But of course, we cannot change that, since this is a well-accepted theory, and you know, people use these two terms all the time. So if you want to change them, you know, that's quite difficult, because people, there were not too many people who raised the same problem that I have had, because the problem is basically because communists doesn't make a difference between the conceptual system and the two language channels. Okay. He all the time speaks about language as a whole, and not separating the linguistic knowledge from conceptual knowledge. The other hypothesis that he raises is the so-called developmental interdependence hypothesis, which means that L2 development and competence depends on L1 development and competence. Basically, this might not be wrong to accept that this is what happens, because if you have well-developed first language skills, that supports you to develop second language skills as well, to understand the second language better, to develop literacy in the second language, and so on. And you remember that in the first part of our class, and that was on the midterm sheet as well, we talked about the fact that definitely if we come to another country with a well-developed first language, then that will help your academic skills in the second language. Why? And it was crucial, the time differences. So we had 3 stages: 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and beyond 12. And we said that the most dangerous part is from 6 to 12, because kids who come at the age of 9, 10, or even 11, they still do not have fully developed language skills in the first language, and fully developed cognitive skills, cognitive knowledge, basically, in the first language. Because in the first language, the basic linguistic development and conceptual development is completed by the age of 12, according to psychologists. And if you go to another country and you are forced to use a second language for your academic development, it's crucial whether you have already completed that development in the first language. If you have done that, then you are in a better shape. If not, that is problematic, you know. And based on this, Cummins talked about something important, and again, this is something that we have to accept, and I think that it's an important thing. He said that when we work in school, so when students work in school, it's important what kind of tasks they get. And he categorized tasks based on how much context the task has to solve the given problem and how demanding the task is cognitive. Let me explain what it is. So what does a cognitively demanding task mean? Cognitively demanding task is usually where you rely on your existing knowledge to solve the problem. Okay? So for example, if you have an equation task in mathematics, that's a cognitively demanding task because you need to collect several pieces of declarative knowledge in your mind to be able to solve that particular problem. And there is another thing, that there is no context that helps you. There is no context to help you. So after all, that task is a cognitively demanding task, and that's a context-reduced task. Because there is no context that you can rely on, just the equation and that you have to solve. However, even when you work with a mathematical task, then there are tasks that have a description. So, for example, the baseball field is this long and that long, or whatever, and so you get a text which gives you a concrete lifelike context for the task. Then we can talk about context embedded. When of course, this context embeddedness sometimes is more of a problem because it may be culture specific. I remember when we came to this country 32 years ago, and my daughter went to school, and we worked on school homework, and I was reading these tasks, mathematical tasks, and it was about the baseball field and the football field. I didn't know anything about the baseball field and the football field. So first I had to figure out what the hell they are talking about before I could actually, when I understood that, right away, the mathematical problem was not a problem at all, but the problem was the context embeddedness. But the context embeddedness was okay for the native speakers of English. That helped them. But for us, that was a context reduced thing, because it was absolutely something that first we had to figure out, So this is where sometimes standardized tests can be biased. When the actual text, that describes the task or whatever is described based on the sociocultural knowledge of the locals, and the poor guys who come from Sri Lanka or Vietnam or Lithuania, they have to figure out first this something that was supposed to have helped them, because that would give you context, but you don't understand the context because of the cultural bias, So this is where the problem is. So that's the reason, why I think that this categorization that Cummins used is good. So here is the summary of that. You saw that on the Prensi as well. As you see that we have 4 different tasks. We have context embedded, cognitively undemanding. So when we have a lot of context and at the same time, the task is cognitively undemanding, that's the best thing. That's the easiest task. So greetings, talking about the weather, writing a letter to your grandmother, and so on. So this is not a problem. The second one to the right, context reduced, cognitively undemanding. So cognitively undemanding, but there is no context. So, you cannot rely on the supportive context. It is something like memorizing a nursery rhyme, for example. Okay, so you have to memorize a particular text, after all. So this is cognitively undemanding, but the context reduced. And then the number 3, context embedded and cognitively demanding. So the context is helpful because it is context embedded, but the task itself is cognitively demanding. Like, for example, to summarize something, So it is context embedded because you have to summarize some kind of events or text or pictures or whatever, So that's the context. So you get the context. But at the same time, it's demanding because you have to reduce the knowledge or retrieve the knowledge from that particular context that you have availability to, okay? And the most difficult thing is when there is no context or very reduced context and the task is demanding. So it is evaluation of something or an analysis of something or reflection on particular feelings and so on. So these are the 4 different kind of task types that Cummins speaks about. And I think that it's really interesting and good. So these are the 4 dimensions again, when we have context embedded and cognitively undemanding, and context embedded and cognitively undemanding. And then, the next one is where we have the context reduced but cognitively undemanding, and the most difficult thing is when cognitively demanding and context reduced. So these are the 4 categories that we talked about. Let's just see some examples for it. I think we have here some examples. So the easiest, here are some examples. Engaging in social conversations with peers, small talk. Nothing is demanding, cognitively demanding, context embedded, So you talk to them in a park or in a school, or in a pub or whatever. Ordering dinner for a picture menu in a fast food restaurant, of course. Although it can be demanding. For example, the other day, I was at a conference and I had to eat something, and that was a terribly demanding task for me to figure out how that tablet worked, because all kind of stupid things were there. So I had to find the right way. So I will not necessarily accept that as a context embedded task, but definitely if you know that, but you have to know, how, what is the logic behind that, you have to try a couple of times. If you do that for the 3rd time, that is cognitively undemanding. But to figure out how it really works, that's cognitively demanding, okay? The next one is cognitively undemanding and context reduced. So, for example, listening to an audio presentation about caring for pets, or getting information by the phone. Oh, this is also, we have to be careful with that, because getting information via the phone for a non-native speaker, that might be a challenging thing, So it is context reduced, but it's not necessarily undemanding. Just think about when you have to talk, for example, to someone at your bank, okay? And you have some questions. And then you talk to someone, there, and of course you have to understand each other without any kind of context, but you can rely only on the language, and that can be also demanding. So my point is that there are particular tasks here, but again, it is not necessarily true that these tasks fit into that quadrant, because the situation can be different, like my tablet situation, or when you talk to someone on the phone and you want to get some information. Of course, if you want to get information, for example, about the weather for next day, and you call a place, where you can get this information, it's not cognitively demanding at all. More cognitively demanding and context embedded, solving simple math computational problems. Okay, so like adding 2 numbers, for example, so that's fine. Or doing a science experiment by following a demonstration, or by following a list of tasks, So first step, second step, their tab, and so on. This is context embedded because you have a list of what to do and you just follow that. The most difficult one, again, cognitively demanding and text reduced, solving network problems without manipulatives or pictures. Yes, just a simple task, where you have to rely on the numbers only. Or writing research reports on assigned topics in social studies and so on. So definitely it is cognitively demanding and context reduced. Or listening to a lecture on an unfamiliar topic, that is absolutely cognitively demanding and context reduced. Okay, so let's see some exercise here. I think here I have, okay. So what we do right now, we look at the description and we try to identify whether the task is cognitively demanding or undemanding, and or context reduced or context embedded. For example, getting directions by phone. Is it context reduced or context embedded? What do you think? Getting directions by phone, is it context reduced or context embedded? Is there any context there when you pick up the phone? No. There's absolutely no context, No, there is no context to help you. You have to ask a question. You have to rely on language only, nothing else. So, and about the task, so cognitively demanding or undemanding. It's not a demanding task, to kind of ask a question about directions. It might be a demanding task to understand the guy on the other side, but to ask the question itself, that's not cognitively demanding at all. Okay, so the context is reduced and the task is cognitively undemanding. Next one, writing a story based on a picture series. Do we have a context here? Yes, picture series. You see that, okay? So there is context that you can rely on. Write up the story, is it cognitively demanding or undemanding? That's usually cognitively demanding to write a story, It's cognitively demanding to write it. However, there is another side of this matter, the picture series, because it's a comics, for example. It's a relatively easy thing to write about that. But if it is more complicated, then you have to figure out what the hell is that and to create a story around that, which can be cognitively demanding. Okay. Next one, solving a math task based on a task description. So we have a task description, as just I mentioned some minutes ago, like describing the task step by step. Is this context reduced or context embedded? David.
It's context embedded.
Yes, there's a task description. And the math task is, of course, cognitively demanding. Yes. Next one, writing a report on an observed class. Context. Do you have the context? Brenda, do you have the context? Observed class.
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely, you're right. Yeah, observed class, you saw that, that's a context. And then you have to write a report. Again, that can be cognitively undemanding because, you saw everything. So after all, you can describe what you have seen. Okay, so it's all right. And next one, find words in a story that are connected with the concept winter. So the task is, here is a story, find words in the story that are connected with winter. How about the context? Do you have the context? Absolutely. Here's the story. And is it a cognitively demanding or non-demanding task to write words that are connected with winter? Caitlin.
Okay, my first thought was demanding, but I believe undemanding.
Absolutely. It's undemanding.
Okay.
Yeah, you know what winter is. And, you know, if especially if you are a native speaker, it's not necessarily a problem for you to find, you know, something very cold or snow or all kinds of things, you know, that might be connected with winter. So it's not. Yeah.
I have a question. Could it be challenging for those people that never been in the in winter?
Exactly, exactly. So that's the reason why I mentioned earlier, you know, that in these things there might be some cultural bias, because you know people who never experience winter or just experience winter very rarely or something, you know, of course it is difficult for them to kind of make decision about what kind of words are related with that. So again, going back to mind being relational, prior experience. Okay, so this is where we have to talk about the conceptual system, you know, because it's not necessarily, because the linguistics is the secondary, the primary is whether you have had that experience, you know. And if you have that experience, it's easy to handle the language, to find the words. But if you haven't had that experience, you know, as Brenda said, of course, this is difficult. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Writing a complaint to the dean about the professor. So what do you think? Writing a complaint to the dean about the professor. How about the context? Is context reduced or context embedded? Yingru, what do you think?
I think it's a context embedded.
Yes, of course, you have a reason to complain, so you had a context there, you know, with the professor, something. So this is context embedded. You know, how about writing the complaint? Is it cognitively demanding or non-demanding?
It could be demanding for people who don't speak the language, maybe easier for
Absolutely.
native speaker.
Yeah, it can be cognitively demanding because you have to be careful with your language. And so how you actually describe what exactly happened, you know, it's crucial how you select your words, how you put your sentences together and so on, you know. So after all, yeah, you're right. And I cannot imagine actually that in this situation, the task to write the complaint is cognitively on demand. It is cognitively demanding all the time, you know, no matter what kind of complaint we are talking about. There is one more before that, reading a poem and interpreting it to text. So you read a poem and then your task is to interpret that poem to the class. So how about the context? Do you have the context here? So is it context embedded or context reduced? Elizabeth.
It's embedded.
Yeah, absolutely. The poem is in front of you. You read the poem, and the task is basically to interpret that context that you read, you know. So, and that is already more challenging, you know. How do you interpret that? You know, because it's one thing that you read that and probably understand that quite a bit, but to interpret that, that is cognitively demanding. And of course, itself, the poem can be also challenging to understand, but the context is there. The context is there. It's another thing whether, you know, cognitively you really are able to kind of process that properly. Okay. Do you have any question? Do you understand how we actually make this decision whether the context is reduced or the context is embedded? or whether something is cognitively demanding or cognitively undemanding. We will practice that with some more tasks. Probably in the final, I'm going to give you this type of task, or at least one. However, again, interpretation, that's the important thing. That's the important thing. To explain, okay, you can say that this is contextually used in my opinion because, and you write it down. Okay, so why you think that this is contextually used? And you can be right because, you know, as a native speaker, you have, as Brenda said, for example, with the wind, in connection with the winter, that you do not have much experience with something, you know. And of course, that case, you find it context reduced or whatever, you know. So after all, in these tasks, again, going back, for example, the phone example, where getting directions by phone. So you pick up the phone, that is absolutely context reduced, and then getting direction to formulate the question is not a problem. However, the problem, the cognitively demanding task could be understanding what is on the side. But again, be careful, because here, what you have to evaluate is getting directions by phone. So it's you. It's another thing to, for example, understanding the directions by phone. That's another task. Okay, that's a different task. And from the perspective of cognitively demanding or cognitively undemanding. Okay, guys, I have to stop here. I think I have finished. I've covered everything that I wanted. So we need to have a 10-minute break. And after the break, we come back at 5:50. 5:50, and we start with the first presentation. As we agreed, that will be Caitlin, and then the second presenter will be Elizabeth. Okay, so that's the order of the presentation. So please come back at 5:50. Thank you. See you soon.